Okay, folks, our second speaker tonight is our first keynote speaker. We're fortunate to have Josh Broder here, the CEO of Tilson. Josh has been serving as CEO of Tilson, a national leader in telecom consulting, design, and build services. Under his leadership, Tilson has grown from 10 employees to over 1,200. Quite impressive, Josh. Earning a top spot in the Inc. 5000 list for the past 12 years. He's also the founder and CEO of Tilson Infrastructure, which develops, owns, and leases back telecom sites nationwide. Josh also earned a Bronze Star as an Army signal officer in Afghanistan on missions in Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Thank you. Josh holds a bachelor's degree from Middlebury College and is a graduate of AT&T's Operation Hand Salute at JFK University with a certificate in entrepreneurial studies. Let's give a big hand to Mr. Josh Broder.
Thanks, appreciate it. Can you hear me now? Is that guy still around? The hear me now guy? Good morning, everybody. First, thanks to Kristen for inviting me to speak today. Appreciate it. And I'm just really excited to be here in person. And I know this is not the first year of being back together in person, but I will always now appreciate what it means to get together as an industry and spend a little time together and to peer group and to be committed to sharpening our tools and really focusing in on our craft. And so nice to see everybody. And I'm here with a number of members of my team, but we've also seen our customers and our suppliers and the whole ecosystem here. And so big thanks to the South Wireless team for running a conference that just attracts a great group of engaged people. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about really what we're seeing in the field. And so I'm calling this Field Notes on Capacity. And I'm going to talk about three specific capacities. I'm going to be talking about the capacities on the network. I'm going to be talking about the capacity in the supply chain and the capacity on labor. And I think of that as the capacity piece being the demand on the network, and the supply comes in with the machines and the materials and the people that we bring to our jobs. So this is going to be a supply and demand conversation about capacity. But first I'll give you a little like truth in lending disclosure. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and what I'm up to as a company. And you know, the overall caveat here is this is just what I'm seeing. So it's not the whole story, but I'll try and give you the data points as we see them. Make this thing work. So first a little bit about myself. I'm the CEO of Tilson and Tilson Infrastructure, and the thing that I'm most proud of is the management team that we've built. A number of them are here today, and together we're on a mission to build America's information infrastructure, which is of course everybody's mission here. And I'm a recovering network engineer. So people get to this work in a lot of different ways. They get to it through civil construction, they get to it through engineering, they get to it from starting a carrier, and I got to it through building networks in the military. And my perspective today is informed by both what's going on in my company and a number of boards that I sit on that give me some visibility into a bunch of different workforce pools. A little bit about my company. We're consulting, designing, and building telecom infrastructure mostly. So when you think about what is Tilson today? We're a designer and a builder, and we also offer some consulting services. And so the consulting services that we offer is only about 10% of our business, but it gives us some insight into what's going on around the industry. And the two places that we consult in are the two places that fund the infrastructure that we develop. So we have a niche consulting practice in helping capital, mostly private equity funds, evaluate transactions before they make them. So we see sort of the private funding stream. And we have a niche consultancy on helping state broadband agencies run their broadband subsidy programs. And so we see the public funding stream. And that's actually where we started. So when you think about the sort of archetype of a design builder, there's the design builders that were engineering companies that started doing construction, and then there's the archetype of the construction company that started doing engineering, and we are none of the above. We're actually the consulting company that started doing design building. And so even though it's a relatively small part of our team, it's an impactful part of our company culture and kind of who we are. We're about 1,200 employees today working across 30 regional offices in the lower 48 states. And we've also spun out an infrastructure company that designs and owns and leases back to carriers some of the infrastructure that we build, which is primarily pole infrastructure. And so we own poles in the right of way without fiber. And so this would be something like a tower company, but it's not really a tower company, it's a pole company. So let's talk about these three capacities: network, supply chain, and labor. And on the network side, we're really talking about what is the demand that drives our industry. So the first thing that's been inescapable over the last couple of years has been the increase in 5G macro site deployment and everybody's rush to get their mid-band spectrum on air. And I'll jump right to the bottom line on that, which is, the carriers are hitting their marks on that. And what we've seen while that's going on is there has still been some focus on getting small cells deployed, particularly for fixed wireless access. I'll talk about that in a little more depth. But while that's all been going on, there's been a ton of fiber deployment happening. Fiber to the home, primarily, but also fiber to the data center, fiber to the cell site, and sort of underlying those national trends of higher demand in wireless and fiber has been a national labor shortage, particularly in skilled labor. I'm going to talk a little bit more later today about the difference between the skilled labor shortage and the unskilled labor shortage. Coming up next, though, is federal funding. So in addition to the network demands that we've had coming from private sources, we expect just a huge amount of federal funds by Tilson's consulting groups accounting about $130 billion of abnormal demand coming onto the market over the next 4 to 5 years of federal subsidy flowing in primarily through state block grants. So that's demand that we do not see yet today, but it's coming fast. Okay, so talking about macro sites have been the hot topic and the big CapEx focus, particularly over the last 24 months. And we think the carriers are really hitting their marks on getting 5G deployed. There's been lots of skeptics about the timeliness of the deployment of mid-band. There's been skeptics about the ability of the industry to hit its marks, particularly with Dish's demand coming in on top of the other carriers' demand. But people are hitting their marks, and in some cases, completing programs. And as Todd from Nate mentioned, some of that demand is starting to ebb. Some of the carriers are starting to wrap up some of those programs. And what we've seen is that the macro site programs have really taken all the oxygen out of the room in the small cell programs from a CapEx standpoint, and to a certain extent in the in-building programs as well. So on one hand, we're at a time of sort of record macro site investment, but we are entering a moment here where the acceleration on that might be slowing, and we may even see some decreases in some carriers. I would note that we have encountered, again for the first time in a while, this tower between the tower problem. As mid-band spectrum is deployed, carriers are increasing not just overall footprint nationwide, but also trying to fill in mid-band coverage gaps in areas where there are not towers. So we've seen sort of heightened tower development for a time, and we're not confident that that's a persistent trend, into the out years. We think that that eventually starts to slow again before other applications drive more tower development. On the small cell side, we thought 2022, while not a bust from a small cell perspective, was kind of slow. We find that it's starting to pick up already in 2023, and we think 2024 will be really busy. The adoption of 5G phones, particularly the 5G iPhone, has driven some capacity constraints on areas that now already have mid-band coverage for 5G, and fixed wireless access, in particular Verizon's ultra-wideband network, is driving demand for 5G small cells now in millimeter wave. And so I would say there's two sort of flavors of small cell development that are starting to increase. One is millimeter wave small cells that are serving both mobility, like really fast mobility, but also fixed wireless access with sort of dense fiber deployments. And also we're seeing both on the pole sites that we own and in our services business, the beginning of C-band small cell deployments to densify the existing C-band deployments. And so when I think about what the CapEx trend has been over the last 24 months, this is not a new trend. It is just a logical continuation of the deployment of mid-band as we've hit our coverage objectives and started to provide really nice C-band coverage all around the country for all these new phones. We start to run into capacity problems, as we always do, as those phones and other machines sort of start to crush the capacity. So we come back in with an understory of C-band small cells. And I think even as we see some carriers taking the foot off the gas on tower CapEx, we'll see some of that replaced with small cell CapEx to come. On the supply chain side, I've talked to a number of suppliers and a number of the other tower company CEOs here this week, and sort of the general consensus is that supply chains are a little looser, which is great news. We've just been through a couple of years of really, really difficult supply chain situation where we just couldn't get the things we need, and probably everybody here has a war story of how, of the 247 components they needed to finish a site, they couldn't get this knick-knack or doodad, which caused remobilization, which caused a change order arm wrestling match with a carrier customer. It's been kind of a grisly period relative to supply chain, but we're feeling a little relief. And the caution that I would note is that the relief has to do with the loosening of general conditions. And what I mean by that is when we were in the middle of the pandemic, we had some supply chain problems coming out of the pandemic, and the recovery, the supply chain problems got worse. And the kind of pressure we saw was on the components that fed the things that we consume. And so the problem wasn't Ericsson's ability to assemble a radio or Corning's ability to manufacture a cable. It was a hard time getting a chip or a hard time getting resin. And those chips and those resins were going into every other plastic component and electronic component in the world, which was under pressure. And so wireless and fiber broadband was competing with washing machines to get the work done. And so as general conditions are cooling and the economy is having a little bit of a challenge, we've seen those general condition pressures on feedstock kind of loosen up, which means that our manufacturers and our distributors are able to get the finished goods that they need. But while that's been happening, there's been an increase in the demand for the finished product. And so we've overcome the first bottleneck, which was, our manufacturers couldn't get the knickknacks that they needed to build the things that we buy. And now we're starting to bump into each other on the things that we buy. And so I think the cooling in wireless CapEx is probably a good fact for that not being as big a problem as it otherwise could be for wireless deployment. But I would predict that it's going to be a big P problem in fiber deployment, which may lead to some tailwinds for wireless to overcome some delays. And so we heard in Todd's video here about fixed wireless access as being a potential alternative for broadband deployment to fiber. And if fiber deployment is going badly or slowly, you could imagine that that could be a tailwind for fixed wireless access. But I think the supply chain problem with certain finished goods that goes into fixed broadband versus mobile broadband is going to be a real problem here coming up soon. Okay, this is what I really want to talk about, and the thing that I'm passionate about is labor capacity and how we build our workforce. And so this is going to be the rest of my talk here. And I want to talk about a tale of two workforces. And so when I think about the kind of people that we employ people who are lower skilled and higher skilled. And so on the lower skilled side, these would be the entry-level workers that come in from something adjacent and get skilled here within the wireless industry and then go to work. And on the high skilled side, they're folks that have been in the industry for a while, they've gained skills and experience, and they have more choices relative to where they're going to be in the industry. And what we found was that during the pandemic and the immediate post-pandemic overheat, that there was real pressure on both, but interestingly, much higher pressure on low-skilled workers. And by pressure, I mean availability and wage pressure. And that was mostly because if you were thinking about starting a career in tower climbing, or you'd been climbing a tower for a year, or you were a entry-level CAD drafter, or you were a professional engineer trying to decide if you wanted to go into tower structurals or something else, you had a lot of choices, and you had wage premiums and salary premiums in some adjacent industries. So like home construction, for example, we're paying premiums that were higher than what our industry pays, as you sort of go downstream from that matrix pricing world that Todd talked about. So you go downstream into the individual wages that supports, people could go hammer nails for $5 more an hour. And so as long as new home construction was hot, there was a ton of pressure on low-skilled labor. And what we have found is that since the general conditions have cooled, that low-skilled labor pressure has alleviated. So we are not having any difficulty getting people in the door and into our schoolhouses internally to skill them and put them to work. Like, those people are all of a sudden available in a way they were not available 10 minutes ago. Different story on the skilled labor side. So the skilled labor side, again, would be this sort of foreman level position in our wireline division, like a drill operator. This person was scarce before, but you're only competing for that person with other people who do this work. You're not also competing with every other industry in the world. And so that skilled labor position hasn't benefited at all from the relief of the stress of the general conditions, because they were never contended by the general conditions. They were just generally in short supply. And as technology implementations continue to grow, even as we see some slowing on the tower side, we see picking up on small cells and fiber, those high skilled positions are under increasing pressure and demand. And so what I would say is things have loosened on the low end and tightened on the high end, and I think that's going to be a persistent trend. And there's only one way out of it, and that's to turn low-skilled workers into high-skilled workers and make more of those people, because you don't get to have more of those people than exist today without doing it the hard way, skilling them and getting them experience. And so I would say that the big challenge then is, as an industry, what kind of structural investments do we want to make at the trade association level? You heard from Todd about things he's doing at community colleges. At the company level, at the sort of subset of the industry level, at the carrier level, what kind of investments do we want to make on taking a low-skilled worker and turning them into a high-skilled worker? And I think the biggest challenge in doing that is the fact that the wireless and broadband ecosystems are deeply reliant on the supply chain to provide embedded vendor financing on the work. And what I mean by that is typically each level of the supply chain, like anybody here that does something for $1, is providing some form of vendor financing from 30 to 150 days. And those pieces tie up cash in the industry, whether you're like a distributor or manufacturer or contractor or an engineer, that ties up cash that could be going into workforce development. And so that embedded vendor financing takes resources away from being able to make the long-term structural investments to skill the labor. And if the labor isn't skilled, quality is worse. We don't have elasticity when we have these surges, and there's safety problems. And so if I could make a plea to the wireless gods here, it would be, hey, we should think about embedding less vendor financing in the industry, and not give that cash back to the owners of these companies, but put that cash into structural workforce development that we would then be able to provide as better service, quality, safety to our collective customers at the end of the day. So here's what's working for us at Tilson, and I say, results may vary. The things that we do sometimes work and sometimes don't work. Sometimes they're a little experimental. We're trying out this job fair idea that's virtual for entry-level jobs. That just happened last week. I'm interested to hear if it was awesome or a bust. But this is just what's worked for us tactically, and some of these things may or may not be applicable to your specific situations. But in terms of thinking about how we develop our workforce, when I left the military and I entered telecom, I was really surprised at the quality of the leadership in the civil sector. It was bad. It's still kind of bad. And it's mostly bad because sort of corporate America and education is sort of oriented towards individual achievement and not group achievement. And it's really, really hard until you get to a Fortune 500 company to find structural leadership development at an institutional level within a company. And so most people learn on the job. And if they had a great mentor, it's great. And if they didn't have a great mentor, it's not great. And so that's sort of easy to identify the problem, but how do we fix it? And the first is, I think leaders have to love people. And I use the term love very pointedly. Like, people get a little uncomfortable with that word love. But, you really have to love people, and you can't fake it. I think the idea that leaders are entrusted with the health, safety, career, self-actualization of another human being is a sacred trust, and that only is right with love. And so I think we have to think about using that word a little bit more. The other thing I see is that sociopaths, where often very valuable members of the team, find their way into leadership. And I did some research in leading up to this talk, and about 1.5% of people are sociopaths. So this would be a sort of a person who has, right, a person who experiences emotions differently. That's not a bad person. It's persons who experience emotions differently than others. It's a sort of spectrum of the human experience. And often sociopaths are great at what they do. But they have a hard time with this love connection with their people. And so as I was doing research into this talk, I found that 3.5% of leaders in corporate America are sociopaths. So sociopaths are twice as likely to rise to a leadership position than the general population. And so I would say there's nothing wrong with sociopaths. Sociopaths belong in the workforce and do incredible work, but they shouldn't be responsible for other people. And that's something that we have to be intentionally on guard for, because sociopaths are good at faking this love thing. They talk about it a lot, but they don't feel it. And we wind up with really difficult and abusive situations around this. And so I name it really pointedly, and this is not like to launch a pogrom on sociopaths. I would just say they belong in individual contribution positions and not in leadership positions in the company. And you probably won't know you've misplaced for about 6 months, and that's only if you're paying attention. And so I would just really encourage us as an industry to find those people and to make sure they stay in individual contributor positions and that the love is felt and not faked. So then we treat people with respect. And that's going to be sort of the subject of a further discussion here. So I just want to sort of like park that thought on treating people with respect and what that means. And as leaders, we need to just get out in the field and spend time with our team. They know where 100% of the problems are in the work that we do. And ultimately, where leaders belong is where the action is. I think as part of this workforce development piece, in addition to better leadership, we need a better emphasis on safety. And that may go back to that cash conversation that I had before. Safety is expensive, but a worthy investment. And at Tilson, we think about safety as being both psychological and physical. And so mostly when we talk about safety, we talk about physical safety. But we also talk about psychological safety where I work. And what that means to us is when you come to work, you can show up as your full self without having to hold back or be embarrassed about that you can voice an unpopular opinion without fear of retribution, that you can live in a retaliation-free zone, that you can feel confident to like really show up and take some risks. And I don't mean like terrible safety risks. I mean like emotional risks. Like you can say something that might be embarrassing or stupid or controversial or potentially challenging somebody's opinion about a thing. And I think there's a connection between physical safety and psychological safety, because it turns out that the unwillingness to share an unpopular opinion or to challenge a norm within a business leads to actual real physical safety problems. The sort of backdoor into physical safety is making people feel confident that they can say what they feel. And then finally, how do we build our workforce through fundamental skills training, which ultimately can be programmatic and can be in the schoolhouse, but because the schoolhouse can't last forever, has to come down to one-to-one mentorship. And I just want to give Nate a little round of applause here for the incredible work they've done here building the TIRAP program and having a one-to-one mentorship program that is not specifically tied to a union program. And TIRAP is just really a world-class thing, and I would encourage everybody to participate. But just thank you, Nate, for like getting that totally right. Okay, So here's the meat of this whole conversation is the treating people with respect. And that seems easy, right? Like, you be nice to them, you're kind, and you can be grateful and thank them for their work. And that is absolutely a part of treating people with respect, but it's kind of not the thing. And so I've been thinking a lot about this as we've evolved and tried to build our culture. What does treating people with respect mean? And I think it means a lot more than being nice to people and thanking them for their work. I think fundamentally it means keeping them informed. And that means they're informed about the situation in their plan, what they're supposed to be doing in that plan, and then telling them when the plan changes. And that sounds so simple, and it's so hard to do. And I bet if we went out to sites all across America and visited them, sight unseen, probably including a bunch of Tilson sites, and you asked an individual contributor on that site if they know what the situation is, if they know what their role in the plan is, if they've been kept abreast of the changes on that plan, like, we'd only be 30% successful at that. It's really hard to get right. And sort of the light bulb went off for me on this in the Army when I took over a platoon, which is like a 50-person element. And when I got to the platoon, morale was terrible. And I couldn't understand why morale was terrible, so I started asking around, like, hey, what's up? And sort of the core at why morale was terrible was that nobody knew what was going on. And so I said, okay, well, that should be easy enough to fix. It wasn't, spoiler alert. But I went and asked the last leader. It was like a person I respected. It seemed like a decent guy. I said, hey, man, like, why does your team have no idea what was going on? They seem pretty demoralized about it. And they said, well, mostly I didn't know what was going on because the plan was always changing, right? So like every day we got pulled all over the place. And the way this little unit was structured, it had 10 teams that went around and built communications facilities around the world. And they were always going somewhere different because, like, things would blow up in countries and they would have to go somewhere the next day. And so the plan was always changing. And so I said, well, what did you do with the information that you had? You know, like, I get that it was uncertain to change every day. And he's like, well, we just, like, told people when they needed to know. And so I said, okay, well, this is easy. I'll just tell people what's going on. And so the new policy was, if I know what's going on, I'll tell you. And if I don't know what's going on, I'll tell you. And I, like, wrote it down on an email, and I sent it to all my subordinate leaders. Like, in that 50 or 60 people, I had, I don't know, 5 or 6 key leaders. And so I sent them an email every day, like, here's what I know. I know these guys are going to Afghanistan in a year. These guys are going to Liberia tomorrow. These guys are going to this training. Like, here's a list of where everybody was going. And I was like, great, problem solved. Well, like 2 weeks later, I started to ask around, and I said, hey, how's it going? They're like, terrible. You came here and you asked me what the problem was, and I told you, and you haven't done anything. I said, sure I have. I told you what's going on. Like, I'm like totally transparent. And they said, well, I haven't heard a thing. I said, oh, didn't you get my email? They said, I don't really have email. I don't look at email. So, okay. So I went to the leaders and I said, okay, all right, you guys may have noticed some of your guys don't have email. If I send you an email, you need to print it out and you need to post it in your day rooms. I said, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so they posted it. And so I went out to the field, and a couple weeks later started asking people, do you know what's going on? I, like, saw these things posted on the wall. I was like, great, they did what I asked. And they actually didn't know what was going on still. Like, a few people did, but there were other people who said, oh, I didn't know. I was in Liberia on that deployment, and I came back and I went right to the field on this training exercise, and so, no, I didn't go through the day room. I don't know what's going on. I was like, oh gosh, how do I inform this person? So I was like, all right, we're gonna print out a bunch of copies of this thing, and we're gonna put them in people's hands at morning formation. Well, you know that where this story goes, like, then there was the guy that was at the dentist, and he missed morning formation. And so finally we started, like, putting them in the windshield wipers of the cars, like of the Humvees. Like, we'd put them right there, so, like, you couldn't drive without moving this freaking piece of paper. And then finally we did daily stand-ups. And the daily stand-ups, this was at a time when, this was early, but video teleconferencing was starting to happen. Like, FaceTime wasn't a thing yet, but we had video teleconferencing systems because we were just lucky enough to be in the Signal Corps. So we started doing daily stand-ups where we, like, talked through that sheet and walked everybody through it. And so this is where we talk in Tilson about, like, 10 times in 10 languages. This is where that was kind of born, which was, like, communication isn't what you think it is. It's really hard to get down to the individual contributor level and tell them what's going on. And if you want to be respectful of people, you have not been respectful of them until they are informed. And so that's the thing we probably kind of suck at. I'd like to think we probably suck less than the industry as a whole, but it's really hard and it's like a daily practice and we're trying to get it right. So that's part of the respect piece. I think the other piece is looking after people's careers. And so I spend something like full-time flying around the country visiting with my team, and the thing I hear over and over and over again as I go into offices is they say, I don't know what I need to do to get promoted and earn more money. So like if I'm talking to a Tower Tech 1, they don't know how to get to a Tower Tech 2. If I'm talking to a drill operator, they don't know how to become a construction supervisor. If I'm talking to a civil laborer, they don't know how to become a foreman. And this practice is a little different than the telling people what's going on because it's less of a daily practice and more of a periodic practice. It has like a different cadence. And so it's about like having a policy and being transparent about how that's done and then posting it on the wall and then doing some like periodic check-ins with people. And this is a thing we're still trying to figure out at Tilson. This is also really hard. And I feel like if I can get to the point where I can fly around the country and ask the question like, do you know who your boss is and do you know what you're supposed to be doing today and do you know what you need to do to get promoted? If like 70% of the people say yes, like that's a grand slam. I'd be thrilled. So this looking after people's careers and having them know what the next step is a part of being respectful to people. And then finally, anticipating different life stories, and this is connected to workforce diversity, which I'll get to next. And this is, if we haven't built a workplace that anticipates that people's stories are different than our own, we have not been respectful for them. And it's hard because we don't know those life stories. Like, I grew up in a middle-class New England family and went to a good college, and I don't know what it's like to deal with like 3 baby mamas at once. And I got a lot of tower climbers that got 3 baby mamas. And if I don't anticipate that their life story is different than my own, I have not been respectful for them. If my policies don't anticipate that they're gonna be a caregiver, have some kind of untraditional family, right? That their family experience growing up is different than my family experience growing up, that the genders might be different, that the time might be different, that the debt pressure might be different. I have not been respectful to them. And so we've been doing a lot of work to structurally encode the way we run workforce to anticipate those different life stories. And they're things like, if you're a white collar, being able to work from home if you want. If you're a parent, whether you're on the paternal leave or maternal side of that, or something in between, that you can take time off when you have a kid. That enters your family. And the kid may enter your family through adoption and not through natural birth. And God, the pushback we got internally when we launched paternal leave. They're like, you're gonna let our tower climbers like go out for 2 weeks when their wife has a baby? And we're like, yeah, like, but we're not gonna call it wife or tower, like whatever. Like, if you are a parent, you get time. And if you're the primary caregiver, you get a lot of time. And if you're a secondary caregiver, you get some reasonable amount of time. And so like anticipating that there's gonna be different family life stories. We have a lot of veterans, I'll talk about that in a minute. But having military leave policy that supports Guard and Reserve service. Understanding that people get sick and need time for that, that people die and they need to mourn. And I don't want somebody in mourning on my job site with their head not in the game. And that people have other responsibilities. They have parents and sisters and best friends and whoever who get sick and sometimes get sick for a really long time and they have to take care of them, like that's a thing. And so these are all expensive and difficult, but not as expensive and difficult as not having a workforce that's available and respected when you need them. And then finally, and this is like a piece that I came to a little later in my career, was celebrating the success when people leave. So a lot of companies, it's like if you're not with us, you're against us. And that's not the way we roll today. It was probably the way we rolled till we were about 25 or 30 employees. It was like as a business owner person who would like put my house up and was like working hard every day. When somebody was like, I'm leaving to go to your competitor, I was like, that is a betrayal. It keeps stabbing me in the heart. Oh my God. It's like really wounding. It was hard, emotional. Today we celebrate the success of that employee. We're like really happy that they got to take a step. And I learned that lesson from Enterprise Rental Car. I don't know if you ever rented a car from Enterprise Rental Car, but the person at the desk is like the most intelligent customer service person you've ever encountered in the retail world. And it's because they're not gonna stay at Enterprise Rental Car. They basically have every person at that desk is an intern who's going to outplace into the Fortune 500. And the reason they get the best people at their front desk is because they're all gonna outplace into the Fortune 500. And they know that this is a place they can go to be successful. And so my call out here is, like, look, employee bases can be fluid. We're all going to employ all the same people. And part of treating those folks with respect is doing what's right for their career in the right moment, which may or may not be with us forever. We hope we do better than average on retention. But when someone makes a decision, we really want to support that decision and make sure they're successful somewhere else. Okay, so finding all the people. This is a diversity piece. I would say that the industry's treatment of diversity has not been great relative to other industries, and that has cost us a lot of money and time and effort and made a lot of people feel bad. Here's what I heard last month. I was at a client meeting with a carrier, not a senior executive, but like a mid-level executive, and we were like talking a little inside baseball and talking about a big meltdown on a project that had happened to one of our competitors. And I didn't know a lot about the inside of the situation, but the executive's comment was like, yeah, like it was kind of a dumpster fire, and then they made that diversity hire, and it got worse. And I was like, holy shit, did I just hear that in 2023? And after I got over my initial shock at like the fact that somebody said that to me, I thought about it a little bit, and I thought, well, like, it's kind of not surprising I ran into a racist jerk, because the world's filled with racist jerks, but it was really surprising that the person said it so unself-consciously, they assumed I would be okay with it. And so like, here was like white guy executive talking with white guy executive, and this person felt like probably we were in a club together on this. And I thought about that, and again, it wasn't remarkable that this person felt that way. It was remarkable that they assumed that I did too. And so this is what's happening in our industry, and it's a problem. And I feel like if we want to get workforce right, we need to tap into all the available workforce. And probably the place that's most under-realized in construction as a whole is having women in construction. And not just women in construction in white-collar positions, but women doing construction out in the field. So this is Faith in this picture. Faith's in our Wyoming office, and when I showed up at the Wyoming office for like my 2 or 3 week after opening check-in, Faith was a civil laborer. She was like literally digging ditches on sites. And I said, hey, what motivates you? And she said, I want to be an equipment operator. Machines is like the missing thing in my life. I've always wanted to like be on equipment. And I said, that's cool. Do you have a mentor here that's doing that? She's like, yeah, I'm working with so-and-so, and he's taking a shine to me, and he's showing me how to use this, and I'm going to get there. I was like, cool. So I came back 6 months later, and I got onto a job site, and I took this picture of her operating heavy equipment. I was like, hey, this is pretty awesome. It's been 6 months. You started as a day laborer with us. Like, how much were you making? It's like high teens kind of wage. I said, that's pretty cool. I said, what are you making now? She's like, mid-20s. I was like, pretty cool, 6 months. Like, you're doing the thing you wanted to do, which was machines, and this. And so here's why Faith was still an employee in 6 months. She had a one-to-one mentor who could see the potential in her, both to hire her as a woman in construction and to advance her through the process. And so we have a executive vice president of workforce, Adria Horn. She's pretty active in Nate if you're over there. And Adria said to me when she first came to work, she said, like, I know there's a lot of talk about like how to do this workforce development in groups that don't get a lot of sunshine, but I actually think it's simple. You just do the thing. Like, if you want more women on your team, you hire and promote women. And so the thing that this local manager was doing was hiring and promoting women, and the way you promote women is you do one-to-one mentorship, just like you do with everybody else. And so that was working really, really well. And the other area that we've tried to really focus on, because it's a back door into a more diverse workforce, is veteran hiring. And so here's what I mean by that. Everybody likes veterans on hiring. Like, it's like the new hotness is hire a vet. And like, there's some pretty obvious reasons. Like, these are not new people to work. They know how to work. They know how to show up on time. They're like been drug tested before they got there. They say yes or no, sir. Anyway, veterans make great employees, easy. But what I think we've under-thought through as an industry is how we serve veterans. And so like, yeah, great. Like an untapped workforce, they can come, they'll be good, but how do we really get the best from that team? And what I have found is that veterans really like to serve again. And so they're looking for something that isn't transactional. I'm going to get into what I mean by that sort of transactional piece in a minute, but what does it mean to serve, and like what is the new mission? And so I read with interest in Fierce Wireless the other day. WIA offers 5G. What was the headline? WIA offers 5G and broadband training to prisoners and veterans. I thought, well, that's pretty awesome. Well, let's invest in these groups. But there's another group that's doing that, the Wagner Group in Ukraine, right? So this is like the Russians are like enlisting prisoners to go attack. And so what's the difference between us investing in prisoners to do work and the Wagner Group like giving prisoners a second chance, like go die in Ukraine? And the difference is the intention in our hearts. And at the end of the day, are we going to serve that workforce and help them meet their objectives, or are they just meat for the grinder? And so I think the place to start with groups that we've underutilized in the past and we think have potential is to figure out how to meet their needs and how to advance them, and then they will take care of us. And so when I think about veterans, I think about how do you get them started? And so we have a program that is a partnership with the Department of Defense, where they place interns at Tilson for somewhere between 2 and 6 months prior to them actually leaving the military. So it's like they go on a kind of leave at the end. They're still in the military, they're still DoD employees, but they come to work for us. It's very low risk for us, it's very low risk for the veteran. And they learn how to transition into a civil job, and then they either outplace to another company or they come to work for us full time. So this guy here with the uniform and the helmet is Robert Cash. Robert is a recently full-time hired employee on our professional safety team. And his job in the military before he got out was running a safety team in the Air Force. And his sort of career ellipse was he started in the Air Force as a guy who repaired bombs and missiles. Turns out that that's like a pretty complicated subsystem. It's not like a thing you just drop off an airplane. It's like computers and guidance systems and whatever. It's a thing you have to maintain. And so he repaired those, and he witnessed a bunch of terrible accidents. There are no like not terrible accidents in munitions maintenance. And he got a passion for safety after witnessing some accidents. And you actually don't find a lot of like professional safety folks in the infantry or the Army, like down in the field where I was. But in the Air Force, they're pretty corporate, and things blow up, and things are expensive. They get a professional safety team. So he worked his way up through the ranks there. He's getting out after 20 years of service. He's a safety professional, and he wants to transition to the civil sector. Well, this guy knows safety. He's got like a degree in safety. But he doesn't know how to work in a company. He knows how to work in the military. And so we did this internship. He learned how to make this transition and become an employee, and then he later became an employee. And so we, like at the end of the day, he got to decide if he was gonna stay. So we made that investment in him, and then he made an investment in us. And so this idea that we're gonna help people meet their career objectives, I think is the first thing, and then they become useful team members second. And I think if you take it in that order, we avoid the Wagner Group trap here, where these folks are meat for the grinder, as opposed to like people we have intention in our heart to help them in their career. I would say a comment on this contract versus W-2 employees. We don't do this as a general practice anyway. All our team members are W-2 employees, but we wouldn't even think about approaching a veteran and saying, we want you to leave the military and come make a career with us, but like you're a contractor and we'll see how it goes. Like, I think generally, setting veterans aside, the practice in the industry of having like contractors versus employees is pretty toxic. And I don't mean like staffing companies who provide employee leasing. That's a valuable service and deals with the like optionality of whether a thing's gonna stick or not. But I mean, the idea of having somebody in your company for 2 or 3 years on a contract versus as an employee is a pretty tough message to send to that employee about them potentially being disposable. And if we want people to stay in the industry, we've got to make sure they know they have a future in the industry. So finally, on the veteran side, just to close this out, supporting our Guard and Reserve members. Veterans are often in the Guard and Reserve, which can be a pain in the neck for the employers because they disappear for periods of time for training and for deployments. And I think if you want veterans in the company, you have to be prepared to support that. Like you don't get one without the other. And so we have a program around that, and we basically continue to pay that veteran their top off salary while they're doing that activity, so they don't take a big pay cut when they go back out on drill, because they're probably making more in the civil sector than they were in the military. Okay, so how's it going? We're recruiting a lot of people. Like these things are working. We got about 23,000 applications last year for about 700 positions. And we'll hire about 1,000 people this year. We're about 200 into that 1,000 people, so it's working. And the only caveat is this is what's worked for us. It's a single data point. We don't have all the answers, and everybody's businesses are unique, but we really feel passionately that the workforce experience can be different, and people can make a career in companies in wireless and not just bump around infinitely. But cool toys help. So I was in Las Vegas last week, and I got to fly a microtrencher like a drone. So this is like a truck that moves by itself from this control pad, and instead of having to like trench into a site, you can cut into a site, lickety split fast. And so actually tooling helps. And I've heard from our employees over and over again, they're like, hey, like everybody knows the new truck story. People want to go into a new truck, but like having the right tools where I don't have 10 people with shovels digging, I can like come in and do this thing really quick. We also want to elevate the workforce experience and say, I'd rather have an equipment operator than a day laborer. And so we want to like skill our people and use more tools, and that actually helps in recruiting and retaining the right people. So thanks for your time and attention. I think I'm going to hand the baton back, and I'll take questions for as long as they'll let me take questions. 5 minutes. Let's see. Sharp here in front.
Earlier you mentioned increase in small cells in the millimeter wave, and we're getting a lot of different ideas about what the range of us, what a small cell in millimeter wave can be. I was just wondering if you have any real solid feel for just how far these things will work in a fixed wireless access situation.
Yeah, really astute question from Sharp. Around sort of what the ranges here are in a FWA application for small cells. So we're seeing like two flavors of small cells. We're seeing standard mobility sites that are also being used for FWA, and we're seeing things that are purpose-built for FWA that sort of look like a small cell. And so on the first category, 28 gigahertz most commonly, 3-sector small cell on a pole kind of thing, maybe 2 sectors depending on the topology. And we're seeing 500 to 1,200 feet kind of ranges depending. Super, super, super line of sight. So they don't have to be high, but they have to have an unobstructed view, and like foliage is an obstructed view, even a little bit of foliage. And so we think of these as pretty local. In my own neighborhood, there's a 28 gigahertz small cell with a fixed wireless access product that the carrier is selling right in front of my house. And I'm not buying it currently, but I've tested it from my phone in the driveway, and I get over a gig in my driveway. And it's like a $25 add-on to the plan if I wanted to buy it. And if you go down the street on that topology, there's a fiber running down the street, and every like 4 or 5 houses, there's one of those nodes. So it's incredibly dense and incredibly short range. And the experience is fiber-like. So the way I would think about it is, it's a fiber network, but the drop's been replaced with a 28 gigahertz loop. It's not a wireless network writ large. Now what I have seen is in other millimeter wave applications that I would call more like in the WISP world, they call it a micropop. This would be like a pole with some 60 gigahertz or 28 gigahertz or something else, like directionally pointing at the home as opposed to like sectors on a site. And those have longer ranges. And when you pop it up on a tower, we see ranges getting into the, kilometer-ish, sometimes 2 kilometers under like ideal conditions, and lots of claims that it works farther, and we'll see. I think the felt experience on millimeter wave is evolving, and I'm really excited about Verana's product that uses that millimeter wave RAN as backhaul to reduce the fiber density, which ought to reduce the cost, which ought to allow these kind of networks to get into more places. Verizon's running a commercial trial of this Verana product. It was reported in Fierce. So keep an eye on that product. I think it's kind of interesting because I think it brings the price down, which allows those nodal densities to go deeper. Because remember, the cost problem isn't the node. The cost problem is the fiber. So if you can have less front haul fiber, then you can deploy more nodes. That's my take on that. Yeah, I think we're out of time. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Great.